There is a moment every species that has ever reached the stars knows it, when a child stops believing the universe is safe. For humans, it happens in 100 small ways. A dog that doesn't come home. A parent who doesn't walk through the door. The first time you learn that the world is bigger than your arms can hold and colder than your blankets can fix. Humans call it growing up. They write songs about it. They build entire religions around surviving it. The Valari called it Kethsolan, the final silence. The moment when a young one opens their mind to the universe and hears nothing back. Sova had been in that silence for 11 days. 11 days since the colony ship Endless Green went dark. 11 days since the emergency pod jettisoned her, a 12-year-old girl with bioluminescent skin and 4 fingers on each hand, onto a frozen rock orbiting a dying star in a system no one had named yet because no one thought it was worth naming. 11 days since her food synthesizer stopped working, her distress beacon reduced to a blinking red light that was either calling for help or simply counting down, and she could no longer tell which. She had tried everything her people had taught her. She had broadcast on every Valari frequency. She had sent light pulse signals into the dark using the ship's emergency mirror array. She had waited, and hoped, and then waited some more, and the universe, vast and cold and completely indifferent to the fact that she was 12 and scared and had not slept properly in over a week, said nothing back. On the 11th day, Sova found the emergency protocol buried in the deepest folder of the pod's operating system. The one nobody talked about out loud. The one that existed for situations exactly like this, when hope had used itself up and the math of survival had become very simple and very brutal. The protocol was called Valari Final Notation. Her people were precise about their endings. Even dying, they documented. She began to fill out the fields. Name. Age. Colony of origin. Date of final notation, *. She got to the last field, message for the record, and sat for a long time with her 4-fingered hands resting in her lap. Her bioluminescent skin flickering, the pale gray that meant exhaustion, the pale blue that meant grief. She typed, I tried, and then, from somewhere in the dark, something answered. Not in Valari. Not in any language her translation matrix recognized. Not even in the radio frequencies her people used for long-range communication. It came in on a wavelength so old, so primitive, so laughably short-range that her pod system had nearly filtered it out as background noise. An ancient broadcast format. Analog. Warm with static. Carried on electromagnetic waves that her own civilization had abandoned 6,000 years ago because they were, by every technical standard, embarrassingly inefficient. And, yet, the voice on the other end of that ancient, inefficient signal was singing. Sova did not understand a single word. She stopped filling out the final notation form. She listened. This is not a story about humanity saving the day. Humans are not the strongest species in this universe. Not the fastest. Not the oldest. They do not have the Dravi's natural armor plating or the Velesi's hive-mind tactical precision or the Vorath Empire's 5,000 years of unbroken military tradition. In almost every measurable category of galactic survival, humans are, at best, mid-tier. What humans have, the thing that makes every other species either deeply uncomfortable or quietly fascinated, is something that doesn't show up on any strategic assessment. They simply cannot stop trying to help. Not because they're commanded to. Not because their biology demands it. Not because some ancient law requires it. Just because. A child was ready to give up. The universe answered in static and song. What happened next changed both of them. The pod was not built to last this long. Sova knew this the way she knew most things now, not from reading a manual but from watching small systems fail one after another, like lights going out in a hallway at the end of a long night. First the food synthesizer. Then, the secondary heating coil. Then, the external sensor array, which meant she could no longer see what the frozen rock outside looked like, only feel it pressing cold through the walls of the pod in a way that had become so constant she had stopped noticing it and, that was, she understood dimly, probably not a good sign. She was 12 years old. She had studied basic survival theory in school. She knew what it meant when you stopped noticing the cold. The Valari were not a species that panicked. That was something her mother had told her once, in the calm and precise way her mother told her most things. We feel everything, Sova. We simply choose what we do with the feeling. Her mother was a colony administrator who had once talked a cargo ship crew out of a mutiny using only her voice and a carefully prepared list of logical alternatives. Panic, her mother believed, was just fear that had forgotten it had options. Sova had spent the first 3 days running options. She had catalogued every item in the pod, cross-referenced survival potential, rationed the remaining water packets to the milliliter, and sent distress signals on every Valari frequency in rotating 20-minute cycles so as not to drain the battery below the threshold needed to maintain life support. She had done everything correctly. She had been methodical and precise, and her mother would have been proud. The universe had not cared. By day 6, she had started talking to the pod's basic operating system not because it was sophisticated enough to respond meaningfully but because the silence was beginning to develop a weight that pressed on her chest when she tried to sleep. The system's name was a default designation, a string of letters and numbers, so she called it something else. She called it Miru, which in Old Valari meant the one who listens without speaking. This seemed appropriate. She told Miru about her family. Her mother, her father, her younger brother Ven, who was 8 years old and had a habit of collecting small rocks and assigning them personalities and keeping them in a box under his sleeping mat. She told Miru about the colony they had been heading to, a new settlement on a world called Vaila Sonus 7 that the advance teams had described as having seized the color of amber and a sky that turned 3 different shades of green at sunset. She had been looking forward to the green sky. She did not tell Miru what she actually believed had happened to the endless green, some things you could think in the back of your mind without giving them words, and giving them words would make them real in a way she was not ready for. On day 8, she had found the children's story her father had loaded onto the pod's media drive before they left. A precaution, he had said, in case the journey was long. The story was old, one of the oldest in Valari children's literature, The Seedling Who Walked Too Far from the Garden, about a young plant being who wanders beyond the boundary of her world and gets lost in the great dark between stars. In the story, a friendly star notices the seedling crying and bends its light down to show her the way home. Sova had always considered this story factually inaccurate since stars did not have the cognitive capacity to notice anything, but she read it anyway, 3 times, and the 3rd time she cried in the way that is very quiet and very thorough, the kind of crying that leaves you feeling scraped out and somehow lighter after. Stars did not bend their light for lost seedlings. This was a thing she knew. She started the final notation form on day 11 because the battery was at 19% and the temperature inside the pod had dropped to a level where her bioluminescent skin had almost entirely gone dark. The Valari used their bioluminescence the way humans used facial expressions. It was not something you controlled consciously but something that happened when you felt things. Dark skin meant cold. But dark skin also meant hopeless, and Sova was honest enough with herself, sitting in that small frozen pod with 19% battery and the final notation form open on the screen in front of her, to admit that the dark was not just from the temperature. The form had 7 fields. Name, age, colony of origin, ship name, date, known circumstances, and message for the record. The Valari were a species that had survived long enough in space to understand that sometimes ships were lost and sometimes people were lost with them, and someone had decided centuries ago that the lost ones deserved to leave something behind that was more than just silence. More than just a dark pod on a rock in an unnamed system. She filled in the first 6 fields carefully. She had her mother's precision, if nothing else. The 7th field, message for the record, she sat with for a long time. There was so much she could write. She thought about writing something for her mother. Something for Venerable, something that captured the green sky she was never going to see or the way the amber seas had sounded in the advance team's reports, like a place that deserved to be known. She thought about writing something that explained what it had felt like to be 12 years old and lost and cold and waiting for a universe that had apparently decided it had more important things to attend to. In the end, she wrote 2 words. I tried an asterisk not because there was nothing else to say. Because everything else felt too large for the small white box on the form, and because those 2 words were true in a way that the larger things might not have been. She had tried. Every method, every frequency, every ration, every option her mother had taught her to consider. She had tried. She moved her finger toward the submit button. The pod's audio system crackled. Sova went very still. She knew every sound the pod made. She had been living inside it for 11 days and she knew the particular sigh of the heating coil cycling, the low thrum of the battery doing its slow work, the occasional knock of debris against the outer hull, which had frightened her the first time and become background noise by day 3. She knew the pod's sounds the way you eventually know the sounds of any small space you have been trapped in long enough. This was not a sound she knew. It was coming from the antenna array, the emergency short-range antenna, which she had left passively monitoring simply because switching it off required a small amount of power she had not wanted to spend. It was pulling in a signal on a frequency so far outside standard Volari communication ranges that her translation matrix had flagged it as probable interference and tucked it into a backchannel she almost never checked. Static. Warm, textured static, the kind that meant the signal was traveling a long way and losing pieces of itself along the route. And, underneath the static, a voice. A single voice, doing something that her translation matrix had absolutely no category for and, therefore labeled, with the blunt literalism of an overwhelmed system, non-linguistic rhythmic vocal performance, the voice was singing. Sova did not close the final notation form. She simply stopped looking at it. She pulled up the audio channel and turned the volume up as high as it would go and sat in her dark pod on her frozen rock and listened to something she had never heard before, a voice she did not recognize, from a species she had never encountered, singing something in a language she did not speak, in a format so ancient and technically primitive that her pod system had nearly deleted it as noise. She could not understand a single syllable. She could not look away. There is something that certain kinds of sound do to living creatures regardless of species, regardless of biology, regardless of what language their brain uses to process the world. Something about rhythm, something about the rise and fall of a voice that is clearly feeling something and choosing to make that feeling into pattern, into shape, into something repeatable and, therefore, survivable. The Volari had music. Every species Sova had ever learned about had music, in one form or another, because it turned out that making sound into meaning was a thing that living things did when other kinds of meaning ran out. She did not know what this voice was singing about. She knew what it sounded like. It sounded like someone who had also been in the dark. It sounded like someone who had stayed. Her finger, which had been half a centimeter from the submit button on the final notation form, moved away. She did something she had not done in 4 days because battery conservation had made non-essential activity feel like theft. She opened a broadcast channel. Not on a Volari frequency. On the same ridiculous, ancient, short-range, technically embarrassing analog band the voice was using. Her translation matrix could not help her. She did not have words in whatever language this was. She had something older than words. She opened her mouth and she sang back. Not a Volari song specifically. Not any song in particular. Just her voice finding the pattern of what she had heard, mimicking the shape of it the way her hands might trace a drawing she had not made, feeling out the edges of something that belonged to someone else and reaching toward it anyway. The static shifted. The other voice stopped mid-phrase. Silence, 7 seconds of it, which is a long time when you are sitting in a dark pod on a frozen rock at 19% battery wondering if you have just done something deeply strange and, possibly pointless. Then, the voice came back. Different this time. Not singing. Speaking. Rapid, warm, full of a quality that her translation matrix could not name but that she could identify by something older than translation. It was the sound of someone who had not expected to find something and was not entirely sure what to do now that they had. Her matrix struggled. Fragments surfaced, best guesses, statistical approximations of meaning pulled from the largest xenolinguistic database the Volari science community had compiled. It was not a language they had encountered before. Not Dravi. Not Velesi. Not any of the 12 spacefaring species currently documented in Volari records. One word came through clearly. Not because her matrix recognized it but because it was shorthand. The voice said it the way you say a word that carries more weight than its syllables can reasonably hold. One word, repeated twice, rising at the end in a shape that even the most basic translation framework recognized as a question. Hello? Hello, Sova's bioluminescent skin, which had been dark for 2 days, flickered. A small light. Blue-white. The color her people used for unexpected things. The color for encountering something that didn't fit the shape of what you thought the world was. She did not know the word. She did not need to. Some words are so old and so simple that they predate language itself, a sound a living thing makes when it reaches into the dark and wants, more than anything, to find that the dark reaches back. She pressed the broadcast button. "Hello," she said, in Valari, which the voice certainly could not understand. It didn't matter. The voice on the other end made a sound that was not a word, exactly. More like what happens to a voice when a person realizes they are not alone anymore and their body reacts before their mind has finished processing the information. Then, it started talking very fast, and she couldn't understand any of it, but she could hear that it was trying, genuinely trying, to make itself understood across a distance of species and language and the cold dark nothing of space, and that trying, that particular quality of effort, clumsy and warm and completely uncalculated, was something she recognized. She pulled her finger away from the final notation form entirely. She closed it. She had 11 days of survival calculations stored in her head, 19% battery, failing life support, and no particular reason to believe that a voice on an ancient analog frequency meant anything that would change the math in any practical way. She started talking anyway. The voice had a name. It took them 47 minutes to figure that out. 47 minutes of two beings on opposite ends of a fragile analog signal throwing sounds at each other across the language barrier the way you throw a rope across a flooded river, not gracefully, not efficiently, mostly just repeatedly and, with great determination, hoping something catches. Sova's translation matrix was working at the edges of its capability, flagging every attempted match with a confidence percentage that stayed stubbornly below 30. The voice on the other end seemed to have something similar going. She could hear it in the way it paused before certain sounds, the way it repeated things in slightly different arrangements, like someone rearranging furniture trying to find the configuration that made sense. By minute 20, they had established that they were both living, both communicating intentionally, and both bad at this. By minute 35, Sova had started using her hands. Not that the voice could see her, the communication channel was audio only, the pod's visual transmitter having died on day 4, but she found that gesturing helped her think, helped her break meaning into its smallest possible components, helped her find the words that were the same shape in any language because some things are shaped the same way for every living mind that has ever needed them: small, cold, need, help. The voice understood help, whatever translation system it was using. That word came through on the first try, and, when she said it, the voice changed immediately, the pace of it, the urgency, something that tightened in a way that her matrix could not categorize but that she understood because it was the same tightening she felt in her own chest, the particular quality of attention that a living thing pays when it realizes another living thing needs something. The name came at minute 47. The voice slowed down and made a specific sound, twice, and she caught it or most of it, and tried it back, and the voice made a completely different sound that she was fairly confident was laughter. Kowalski *, she said, which was probably wrong in at least 2 phonetic dimensions. The voice made the laughter sound again but kept the name. It's settled. She told it her name. It tried 4 times, each attempt slightly different, and, on the 4th try it was close enough that she said yes in Valari, and it seemed to understand that too because it said the name again, steadier this time, like someone who has learned a new word and wants to make sure it stays. Sova *, she did not know yet that Kowalski was a 23-year-old human on a deep space geology survey vessel called the Meridian Star, who had been running a routine electromagnetic sweep of the system when his equipment caught a flicker on a frequency his supervisor described as so outdated it was essentially historical. She did not know that his supervisor had told him it was almost certainly instrument drift, and he had nodded and said probably and then stayed at his station for 4 hours doing what his supervisor would later describe as an alarming amount of focused effort on something we're not being paid to focus on. She did not know that the Meridian Star was a commercial vessel with a crew of 6, no military capacity, very limited rescue equipment, and a contract that did not include getting involved with alien distress situations of unknown origin. She only knew the voice. The voice that had found her on an impossible frequency and was currently, as best she could tell, trying to explain where it was relative to where she was using a combination of sound and what appeared to be some kind of pattern tapping on its end of the transmission that she was attempting to decode as navigational information. She was shivering. The pod interior had dropped another 2 degrees in the 47 minutes since the conversation started. She had stopped noticing this, which she was trying not to think about. She told Kowalski she was cold. It was one of the words she'd been able to confirm he understood. He'd said it back to her early in the conversation, that particular word, and there had been something in the way he said it that told her it wasn't just a vocabulary confirmation. He understood cold in the way that you understand a word when you have felt the thing it names, not just memorized its definition. When she said she was cold, he got louder. Not in the way of shouting. In the way of someone who has just made a decision and their voice is carrying the weight of it, and she did not need a translation matrix to understand what that kind of loudness meant. It meant I am doing something, it meant hold on. She held on. In the hours that followed, 4 of them, which was a long time to sit in a dark pod with 19% battery that was now 17% and falling, talking to a voice across a translation barrier, Sova learned several things about the species on the other end of the signal that her people's xenolinguistic database did not contain. They were bilateral, bipedal, and, apparently operated under a near constant expectation of physical inconvenience. The voice, Kowalski, kept describing things that were happening on his end of the conversation in a tone that her matrix was increasingly reading as wry, as if the difficulties he was encountering were expected, even familiar, and he had chosen some time ago to find them more interesting than distressing. His vessel's navigation computer apparently did not have the system on its charts. This seemed like it should be a significant problem. Kowalski's tone suggested it was simply a puzzle with steps, and the steps were to be worked through methodically. She found this quality difficult to describe but easy to recognize. It was the same quality her mother used when something went wrong, the colony administrator's calm, the voice that said I have encountered problems before and the procedure is to address them sequentially until they stop being problems, but with something underneath it that her mother's calm did not have. Something that was either extremely comfortable with uncertainty or had simply stopped keeping track of how much uncertainty was reasonable. She told him about her battery level. His response was immediate. The tapping pattern changed. She had learned by now to read the tapping. He was communicating something to his vessel's system, cross-referencing something, calculating. She heard a second voice in the background briefly, another person, sharper in tone, and Kowalski's voice responding in a way that was very even and very firm. She asked, because she wanted to know, because not knowing was worse, how long, he tried to tell her. The specific number got lost in translation. What she got, imprecise, assembled from fragments, was something between too long and less than you think. She had learned, in 11 days of survival mathematics, to work with approximations. The battery hit 15%. She rationed her words. She had stopped broadcasting her distress signal on the Volare frequencies 2 hours ago to redirect every available milliwatt to the analog channel. This was not a logical decision in the strict sense. The analog signal was shorter range, technologically inferior, and connecting her to exactly one unidentified non-Volare vessel rather than broadcasting to the entire network of potential Volare responders. Her survival instructor would have marked it as suboptimal. She kept the channel open. Kowalski was still talking. He had apparently decided, or perhaps was simply constitutionally unable to decide otherwise, that silence on his end would be unhelpful, and so in between the navigation calculations and the tapping and the periodic sharp exchanges with his second background voice, he was talking to her. She could not understand most of it. Her matrix caught edges, descriptions, she thought, of things he was seeing, things that existed on his end of the universe. She assembled meanings from fragments, large. Water. Slow. Round. Warm *. She thought he might be describing a planet. Or possibly a meal. The matrix was working well below optimal confidence. It didn't matter. The sound of someone describing their world to you across a language barrier, working hard to find the shapes that might translate, trying to give you something even when the giving is imperfect, that was not something her matrix needed to decode for her. She understood it directly, the way you understand that a hand extended toward you is an offer whether or not you speak the same language as the hand. She talked back. She described the amber sea she had never seen, using Volare words that Kowalski certainly could not understand, assembling sounds that she found beautiful because she needed something beautiful right then, and this was what she had. She described Ven's rocks with their assigned personalities. She described her mother's voice when it was being very calm and very certain, and she did not say what she was afraid of, and she did not say what the alternative was, but she kept describing things, and Kowalski kept making sounds on the other end that told her he was listening. The battery hit 12%. Sova had done the math repeatedly. 12% battery sustained life support for approximately 90 minutes at current temperature levels. The temperature was still falling. The margin was not as generous as the number suggested. She stopped describing things. She told Kowalski the number directly: 12, battery, which she had confirmed as words he understood early in the conversation, and his tapping got faster. The background voice got louder. A third voice joined it. She heard what she was confident was an argument, the particular rhythm of it, the way voices in disagreement have a shape that is recognizable regardless of the words, and then, Kowalski's voice coming through the argument the way a specific kind of water comes through a gap in a dam, not loudly, not forcefully, just inevitably, until the other voices stopped. She did not know what he had said. She knew that he had meant it. Then, he said something directly to her, something short, and her matrix pulled 3 possible interpretations, and she sat with them and chose the one that seemed most consistent with everything she had learned about this voice in the past 4 hours of translation approximation and imperfect assembly and reaching across the dark. I am coming, * 3 words. Possibly wrong in their specifics. Possibly her matrix was working with too little data and too much static, and the real meaning was something more qualified, more contingent, hedged with the practical limitations of a commercial geology vessel with no rescue mandate in an uncharted system. She chose to believe the 3 words. Her bioluminescent skin, which had been dark or near dark for 3 days, did something she could feel but not see: a shift in temperature from the inside, from the bioluminescent cells themselves generating a small amount of heat as they activated. Her people's glow was not something you turned on. It happened. Like breathing. Like the response to a thing that was happening outside your control, and your body was going to react whether your mind had approved it yet or not. She was glowing again. Not brightly. A faint blue-white, the color for unexpected things, the color for encountering something that didn't fit the shape of the universe you thought you were in. Battery at 12%. Life support margin narrowing. Temperature falling. One voice on the other end of an ancient analog signal that her people's technology had abandoned thousands of years ago because it was embarrassingly short-range and technically inferior. Sova calculated her odds and found that the calculation had begun to feel beside the point. She kept talking. He kept talking back. Outside her small pod, in the darkness of an unnamed system orbiting a dying star, a commercial geology vessel with a crew of 6 was doing something that was not in its contract and not in its navigational charts and not in any operating protocol its supervisor had been given authority to approve. It was turning around. It was burning fuel it had not budgeted for and taking a route its computer didn't have charted and committing to a rendezvous with a distress signal on a frequency so old it was essentially antique, all because one person had made a decision in the way that some decisions are made, not through calculation, not through policy, not through any particularly logical chain of reasoning, but simply because the alternative had become unthinkable. Inside the pod, Sova closed her eyes. She did not close the audio channel. She listened to the voice on the other end, still talking, still working, still in the process of doing the specific thing it had said it would do, and her bioluminescence, faint and blue-white, held steady against the dark. The battery hit 11%. She didn't check it again. The pod's life support reached 8% when Sova heard the sound. Not through the audio channel. Through the walls. It was a low vibration at first, something that traveled through the hull of the pod before it traveled through the air inside it, which meant it was real and external and not another system error. She knew the difference by now. She had catalogued every sound this pod made over 11 days, every mechanical sigh and stress creak and thermal contraction groan, and she had never heard this. It was the sound of a vessel close enough to generate gravitational interference with her pod's hull plating. It was the sound of something big. Getting closer. She pressed her hand flat against the pod wall and felt the vibration move through her palm and up her arm and into her chest where it joined something already happening there, the particular physiological response her people had when the math changed suddenly, when a situation that had been moving in one direction reversed. She did not have a word for it in this moment. The feeling was too large for words and she was too tired for words and she was glowing. She could see herself glowing in the reflection of the dark screen in front of her, pale gold now, which was a color her bioluminescence did when something was happening that her body understood before her mind had caught up. Gold meant alive. Gold meant present. She had not glowed gold in 4 days. The voice on the channel, Kowalski, said something sharp and short, and her matrix caught enough of it to understand it was directional information, coordinates, instructions to someone else. Not to her. But then, a pause, and his voice came back, different in texture, lower, and this time she didn't need the matrix at all. She knew that voice texture. It was what a voice does when it has been moving at high speed towards something and is now close enough to see it. Sova *, one word. Her name. The fourth attempt from 4 hours ago, now said with the certainty of something practiced until it stopped being a guess. He said her name like he had been saying it to himself for hours in the dark of his own vessel, and the repetition had made it familiar. I hear you, she said in Valari, which he could not understand, and, in the same breath on the same channel because she could not think of a better thing to do with 11 days of accumulated fear and the feeling in her chest, she pressed her hand harder against the vibrating wall. The external sensor array was dead. She could not see the vessel through any of the pod systems. She could only feel it, the growing vibration, the gravitational shift, something large and warm and powered settling into proximity with her frozen rock in a way that she felt in her spine and her teeth and her steadily brightening skin. Then, contact. Not a crash. Not the brutal impact she had been braced for every time debris struck the hull. Something deliberate, something practiced, a coupling that found the pod's docking port through the dark and connected with a precision that told her whoever was piloting this vessel had done difficult things in difficult circumstances before and had developed the kind of steadiness that comes not from having never been afraid but from having been afraid enough times that the fear no longer interfered with the hands. The seal engaged. Pressure differential hissed through the coupling ring. Then, silence. 7 seconds of it, the same 7 seconds that had passed between her first transmitted sound and the moment Kowalski's voice came back changed. She had time to think, what if this is wrong? What if the translation was wrong and the intention was wrong and I have made the largest miscalculation of my short life? She had time to consider that she did not know this species at all, did not know their history or their biology or what they did when they encountered things they had not encountered before. She did not know what Kowalski looked like. She did not know anything concrete about the vessel she was now physically connected to. She had the voice. She had 4 hours of reaching across a language barrier and being reached back. The hatch opened. The first thing she saw was light. A warm light, yellower than Valari interior lighting, and, after 11 days of the pod's fading blue-white emergency panels, it felt excessive and almost aggressive, and she squinted against it in a way that must have been visible because the shape in the hatchway made a sound and the light dimmed. The shape was bipedal. Her xenolinguistics database had confirmed Kowalski's species as human, and she had learned their general morphology from the database in the hours of waiting, but knowledge and presence are different things, and she had not been prepared for how much a human took up physical space. Not because he was large, by Valari standards he was not especially large, but because of the quality of how he occupied space, like he was very certain of where his body was at all times and comfortable with that certainty. He was standing in her hatchway with one hand on the frame and the other one out. Not toward her. Beside him. The hand was open, palm up, not reaching, just open. Her xenolinguistics file noted that among humans, the open palm gesture was one of the oldest and most cross-contextual signals for I am not holding a weapon. She had read this as an academic data point. She understood it now as something more immediate. He said her name. Correct pronunciation, fourth attempt, now delivered like a thing he had earned. Sova stood up for the first time in 11 days and her legs were wrong, they had forgotten certain things, and she grabbed the pod's grab handle and stayed upright through willpower and the particular stubbornness that her mother would have recognized and that Ven had once described, with the devastating precision of 8-year-olds, as her refusing face. She looked at the human in her hatchway. He was looking at her with an expression that her xenolinguistics file had approximately 12 possible interpretations for, and she sorted through them quickly and landed on the one that felt most consistent with 4 hours of voice, with the quality of how he had said her name, with the open hand and the dimmed light and the 7 seconds of silence before he opened the hatch. The expression meant he was trying very hard not to scare her. Something about that precision, the trying, the awareness of the trying, the fact that he had thought about what a frightened Valari child might need from the very first moment of contact and had organized his behavior around it rather than around what was easy or natural for him, something about that broke something open in her chest in a way she had not given herself permission to let happen in 11 days. She crossed the hatchway. Not because she wasn't frightened. She was. She was terrified in the layered way you can only be frightened when the thing you needed most is suddenly right in front of you, and the relief and the residual fear and the grief you have been holding very carefully in a sealed compartment in the back of your mind all arrive at the same moment, and there is not enough room for all of them. She crossed the hatchway because she was 12 years old and she had been alone for 11 days, and this voice had found her on an impossible frequency and driven a commercial geology vessel across an uncharted route burning fuel it didn't have and opened a hatch in the dark, and her mother had taught her that when someone extends a hand toward you in good faith, you do not calculate whether it is the optimal response to take it. You take it. She didn't take his hand. She was not ready for that specific contact, and he seemed to understand this without being told. He withdrew the open hand as she crossed the threshold, creating space without retreating, which was a calibration she noticed, and filed in a mental folder that was rapidly filling with things she had not expected from this species. She was standing inside a human vessel. It was warm. It was so warm that her bioluminescent skin, which had been glowing pale gold, shifted into something brighter and deeper, a color that had no formal name in official Valari documentation, but that every Valari child learned from birth because it was the color their people glowed when they came home. Kowalski looked at her light change, and his expression did something she did not have a matrix interpretation for. He said something soft, one word, and turned and walked toward what appeared to be the main cabin. He stopped after 4 steps and looked back, and it was the exact same look a person gives you when they are not sure you are following and they want you to follow, and they will wait as long as is necessary. She followed. The Meridian Star had a crew of 6 and a galley that smelled like something chemical and something warm and something else she could not identify, but that her body, unreliably, decided it approved of. The other 5 crew members were in the galley when Kowalski brought her in, and they reacted with a variety of expressions that she was still developing the ability to read, but the thing she could read immediately and without any translation assistance, was that none of them were expressions that meant threat. One of them, small and fast-moving, with hair cut very short, put a cup of something warm in front of her on the table and then stepped back to a respectful distance and said something in a tone that her matrix identified, with uncharacteristic confidence, as offering. She wrapped both 4-fingered hands around the cup. It was the warmest thing she had touched in 11 days. Kowalski sat across the table from her. He had a tablet in front of him. She recognized the technology, a visual translation interface, and he was loading something into it with the focused expression of a person who is doing several things at once and has prioritized them correctly. He slid the tablet toward her. The interface displayed a Valari text prompt. Imperfect grammar, incomplete vocabulary, the product of a xenolinguistics database that had been assembled by researchers who had never met a Valari and were working from intercepted transmissions. But legible. She could read it. We found a Valari colony signal. 1.3 light hours. Other survivors. We go there now, yes, *. Her hands tightened around the cup. She read the sentence again. Other survivors, * 2 words. She stared at them the way you stare at something you need to be real and are terrified to believe because the cost of being wrong is a thing your body already knows the shape of. She looked up at Kowalski. He was watching her with that expression again, the one she had filed under trying not to scare her, but that she was revising now, refiling under something more specific. He was watching her the way you watch someone read news you have given them when you know the news matters, but you cannot know how much until you see their face. She asked, in Valari, which he could not understand. He pointed at the tablet. She typed, with the tablet's limited vocabulary working against her, my family. He looked at the word. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he picked up the tablet and typed slowly, checking each word against the database, and slid it back. We don't know yet. We go and we find out. Together was not in the Valari translation database. He had spelled it out phonetically and, attached a symbol, she recognized it as a universal mathematical symbol for joining two sets, the simplest notation for two separate things that are now moving as one. Together. Outside the galley's porthole, the unnamed star was exactly as cold and indifferent as it had been for 11 days. The frozen rock was already falling behind them, getting smaller, reduced to the insignificance it had always technically possessed. The universe was exactly the same size it had been when she opened that final notation form with 17% battery and 2 words and the very reasonable belief that she had run out of options. The universe had not changed. One thing in it had found her anyway. She did not touch the translation tablet for a long moment. She sat with her four-fingered hands around the warm cup in the warm galley of a human vessel that had no business being in this system and no contractual obligation to be here and no practical reason at all for turning around except that a person had heard something in the dark and decided that the hearing of it was sufficient reason. Her bioluminescence was the deep warm color that meant home. She pushed the tablet back toward Kowalski. She had learned, in 4 hours of imperfect translation across an impossible distance, what this species did when you were honest with them about what you needed. She had learned what they did when the alternative was unthinkable. She typed one word. Go! Kowalski looked at the word. He did the thing with his expression that she had decided meant something between yes and already doing it, and he stood up and moved toward the cockpit, and the Meridian star adjusted course, and the ship's drive engaged with a sound that was nothing like the pod's failing systems, a sound full and steady and pointed at something specific. 1.3 light hours. She did not open the final notation form again. She sat in the warm galley of a human vessel with a cup of something she couldn't identify held in both her hands, and she looked through the porthole at the stars, which were the same stars they had always been but looked different now in the way that things look different when you are moving toward them instead of away, when you are no longer still. Sova did not know, yet, what she would find at the colony signal. She did not know what the next hours would give her or take from her or ask of her. She was 12 years old and she had been alone for 11 days and she was still afraid in the layered complicated way that does not resolve quickly or cleanly, the way that lives in the body long after the immediate circumstances have changed. But she was also in a warm room, moving towards something, with a voice that had found her on an impossible frequency and brought its vessel across an uncharted route and opened a hatch in the dark and asked for nothing in return except to know which direction to point the ship. The universe was the same size it had been. She was not the same size she had been. She was larger, or maybe not larger exactly, more like expanded, like a bioluminescent creature that had been contracted against the cold for too long and was now, slowly, in warmth, uncurling. 1.3 light hours. She held the cup. She watched the stars. She went toward what came next.